Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Talent Game podcast. I'm your host, Joe Burridge, and with me today is John Clark. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Hi, Joe, and thank you very much for inviting me along. I'm looking forward to this very much.
Yeah, same. And so, for our listeners who have no idea who you are, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm John Clark. I've been in the industry for 27 years, so I joined in 1997. I joined BMG Interactive, and I've had stints at Take-Two, Eidos Interactive, SEGA Europe, Tencent, and more recently Curve Games, where I was CEO. I've always been involved on the publishing side of things, and I think I always talk to people about my most formative years were those when I spent 13 years at SEGA. Various things I'm sure we'll talk about, but mainly shifting a business to a Steam-led business, setting up something called SEGA Searchlight and bringing a lot of the SEGA Japanese IP onto Steam, say commercial publishing and working with studios. So currently I am consulting with a couple of developers. So I'm an independent at the moment after leaving my role at Curve at the end of February. And enjoying working with a couple of indie developers.
Yeah, wow, what a career. And you've just seen the games industry morph and change time and time again since those earlier days, especially like 5 console generations even you must have seen at this point as well.
Yeah, and I still remember joining in 1997, and I was basically a national account manager for BMG, selling, when we look back at it, selling games in boxes to retailers that put them on shelves and sold them. Sounds straightforward, but it's a dim and distant memory. So, and I remember at the time meeting lots of people who were already at the company who seemed to have been in the industry for a long time. So back in 1997, there were 10-year veterans of the industry, and I just thought, I'll never be able to get to know anybody here. I'll never be able to sort of settle in. I'll never have the experience that all these people have got around me. And I still, that's still in my head is like, how am I going to settle in? How am I going to become part of this industry, which felt really, really new to me, even though I'd come from a sales background. Yeah, I still remember that time being very green.
Yeah, that's so funny you mentioned that. I remember when I was at Epic Games hearing Tim Sweeney share a similar sentiment of when he founded, what was then to be Epic Games back in 1991. And he was like, I found this company. I felt so much behind the curve, new person on the block. And it's like, because the games industry moves so fast, the point of entry always feels like you're way behind. It's like, actually, no, if you stick at it and build that experience, it's probably a natural feeling for anyone joining the games industry for the first time, I'd imagine. Yeah,
I agree, and I know this isn't a question right now, but I also remember having that feeling. I've been in the industry for just over 10 years. I was at SEGA, it was around about 2008, and for the first time I was elected to go onto the Yuki board, and it was ELSPA when it was then, so that was around about 2008, 2009. And I remember being nervous and going into the first board meeting and seeing people around the board table who I knew but I didn't know, and I just remember sitting there thinking, what am I meant to do? How am I meant to do it? All of these people, from Nintendo and EA and Ubisoft and Sony and Microsoft, and I was thinking, I'm out of my depth here. I don't know what these people know. They've been here for a while. They know how to serve on boards. They work for these big professional companies. Not that I didn't. I mean, I'd spent 8 years at Eidos and I was in my second year at SEGA. And I guess that's when you start to think about things like imposter syndrome and learning and what you do in situations that are brand new to yourself. How do you ground yourself? How do you take the next step forward? But I think we're always faced with something new. And how you deal with the new, I think, is sort of what defines a lot of us in the industry.
Yeah, fantastic. And an industry that you can only succeed in by constantly moving and evolving. You stand still in the games industry. That's a definite recipe for the disaster. But I'm so looking forward to unpicking all of this and getting into these talent discussions today. Before we do that, though, I'll jump into my standard introduction question. So the first one would be, what are you playing right now?
Well, I am playing a game called Dungeons of Hinterberg. And you probably haven't heard of that. A few people have heard of it. But it was a game that we published, or was published at Curve sort of, a couple of months ago. And one that I had the pleasure of signing and working with the studio. The studio is called Microbird. The game is called Dungeons of Hinterberg. I'm by no means trying to sell it, just introduce it to you. And it's just a delightful, beautiful looking, almost like action adventure, cozy social sim set in a fictitious town in the Austrian Alps. And it's just a wonderful experience. And Philip and Regina, the two founders of the studio, will probably be both pleased that I'm playing it and annoyed that I'm still playing it, because I started playing it a long time ago. So, I'm enjoying it.
That's one of those games I'd been following on Twitter for quite a while. And I think what first caught my eye about that one is the art style, that cel-shaded, stylized art style, and like I said, this combination of this cozy exploration game, and then like the name suggests, like it's exploring dungeons and some cool combat with big swords and things, right?
Yeah, look, I'm sure we'll talk about the industry and the challenges and the opportunities with the industry. So throughout my time at Sega, and when we established Sega Searchlight, that was when I really probably started looking at independent games and independent studios, and I hadn't done that before. So being at Curve meant that that's all I looked at. So you just see these delightful new creations from innovative and creative new teams, and you start to develop an attachment and a love for and an appreciation for the output of these smaller teams. And when I see this game, it's like, I enjoy playing it. I enjoy the places it takes me to, but I also knowing where it originated and knowing what's been put into this game just adds another layer to my enjoyment for it.
Yeah, I love that point, and that's exactly how I feel when I play an indie game that I absolutely love. I know it's a small team. And so actually a good example of this, Balatro just launched on mobile the other day. And I was like, I'm going to just buy this again. I know that this was a solo developed game, and I'm going to buy it on mobile again, even though I've already had it on PC console, but it's nice to play it on the go as well. But I just know that funding is going to a smaller team, obviously the publisher as well and everything else. But I do love seeing it's so much more personal sometimes with these indie developed games. So you mentioned 27 years in the games industry. How did that even start about? How did you get into games?
It's interesting what you referenced before in terms of joining being in a games industry when the change is constantly happening. I can say I'd been a gamer to a certain extent as a kid, and I'm sure everybody has these stories. I was old enough to have a black and white television. I was old enough to have Pong. I was old enough to have a ZX Spectrum. And I was old enough to remember the first Space Invaders and Galaxians and Asteroids and Defender coming into the local cafe. And even though it sounds a little bit predictable, the snooker hall, yes, that did happen. And I enjoyed all of that. And it got to a stage, I think, when I was sort of in my late teens, where I wasn't playing a lot of games, and I went out and started getting jobs. And I worked as, I got a job as a sales rep, and I worked for a tobacco company as a sales rep. And I thought, well, this isn't really the sort of product I really see a future in, obviously. And I ended up working then as a sales rep for 20th Century Fox back in the days of VHS video rental cassettes. And at that period in time, sort of in my early to sort of mid-20s, I'd started to get a taste for video games again. I'd realised that I'd neglected it, but I started to see things like the PlayStation coming. And I played on a Game Boy and a Sega Game Gear. I saw the PlayStation. Actually, no, it was pre-PlayStation. I started playing a Mega Drive, and that started to make me think about the games industry differently. But then when I was at Fox, literally a friend of mine who I worked with at Fox had left to go and join BMG, and he left to join BMG on the music side, and we'd always stayed in touch. And we were just talking one day, and he was talking about I can tell you exactly what he said to me. He said, BMG have got this interactive department. They're looking for a national account manager, and they've got this game that everybody's talking about. And I was like thinking, I want to get into a different industry. I love the entertainment industry. The games industry sounds good, even though I don't know much about it. And I'm getting my love for games back again, and I want to be close to it. And on top of that, I think I was looking at the technology in games and thinking, I'm not a technophobe, and probably the best way of me staying up to date with everything is to try and be in the middle of it. And basically, it was a question of just introduce me, and I had a chat, had the interviews, went through the process, and got the job, and I haven't looked back, and I met sort of the then boss of BMG Interactive was a guy called Gary Dale, who then ended up being my final boss at SEGA, sort of 24 years later when I was at SEGA, and it was a nice turnaround. And that game that my friend said to me, everyone's talking about it, they think it could be good, was the first PlayStation and PC version of Grand Theft Auto. And I remember sort of like, I'm fascinated with this. This looks really interesting, the top-down one. And that was it. And then sort of my career went from there, and it was like national account manager, sales manager, export sales, etc., until it started to go through some significant changes whilst I was at SEGA.
Yeah, wow. And you progressed to EVP of publishing at SEGA, then you're the CEO at Curve Games. So you progressed to some incredibly senior positions. And what we were talking about before we hit the record button, I was saying that, at least from our eyes in the VC, where we consult with startups and things at the moment, CEOs should be really focused on two things as top priority, like the funding of the company, ensuring the company has money, and then also talent, ensuring the company has the right talent implemented at all levels. So naturally, I want to focus on the talent side rather than the money side. And just to hear your take on this. So how do you ensure you yourself as a leader are then surrounded by top talent? Whether that's the people above you, your peers, or I guess more importantly, especially when you're CEO, the people below you. Yeah, I'd like just high level, what's your take on that top talent discussion?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and I think I know you said top line. I'll try and keep this as top line as possible, but I think there are two different segments to where I've hired teams. One of them was a packaged goods industry, and one of them was a digitally led industry. And there are some slight differences there, because when we were in the packaged goods industry, everything was defined by roles and structures that people were familiar with, and a way of working that was really familiar. The games were in boxes, they went on shelves, and they then sold to players, and customer service was customer service, and there was nothing that was digital, there was nothing that was social, and everything was geographically regionalized. So if you worked in the UK, you worked in the UK. If you worked in Germany, you worked in Germany. And so when you're building teams, it really is quite straightforward and defined. Where we are today, there are layers and layers of change that are happening all the time. We are working for a digitally led global publishing and global communications, within that sort of environment, which is constantly changing, and it's accelerating, and everything from levels of quality to toxicity to speed of market to community building to marketing tactics changing to sales tactics to discovery, all the things that are changing in the industry are going to be constantly changing, and that ultimately makes your job, makes my job a lot more difficult. And a lot more challenging, and recruitment a lot more challenging. I've always thought of three things when I recruit, and it's and I'm sure I'm not the only one, everybody does this, but it's can they do the job, will they do the job, and will they fit? So you sort of want this sort of grounding where you think, okay, well, I know the role that I'm looking for, and I've got a job description, and I've been able to do all of that, and so can I tick it off? That's obviously the first and obvious thing is, do you have the experience? And then do they have the motivation, and how much they want the job, and the fit? And I think that the fit is now so important, and it always has been, and it is the most difficult thing to call. And, it could be that, you're my friend, I know you really well, we had a great interview and I bring you to the company. And at that point, our relationship changes, right? Because we've been friends, but we've never been friends working with each other, right? So that fit and understanding that fit is interesting. And that's because when I think about the experience that someone's had and the job description and the motivation, that changes because job descriptions are changing now based on what the industry goes through. So it could be that, you bring someone on board that is purely focused on sales, but that changes. That could change next week in terms of, okay, now can you do this? Here's something new. So you sort of think about, for me, it's thinking about that fit. It's thinking about that personality, but it's also thinking about the grey areas, ambiguity. Where have you been in a situation where you've been, you haven't had the plans laid out for you, where you've, we can use it sort of, bring me solutions, bring me problems. Where have you operated in ambiguity? And I started to, if you'll humour me for a second, that when I was at Curve, and to a certain extent, when I was at Tencent and I was, recruiting or interviewing people, definitely at Curve, I think I compared sort of the world of sort of, forming and building an indie company that would definitely go through some changes. The first thing is it needed to be influenced by the people that were there. And that was sort of different to, say, someone like at SEGA. At SEGA, you're on this like timeline. If one of the motivations for going for SEGA, it's to do the job, it's to do the job well. But what is my role within the story of this amazing history and this amazing future of this really iconic company? And that's different to working at somewhere like Curve. It's like, what are you going to do to make this company successful? No, not what are you going to do to play a part in the success, but what are you going to do to make this company successful? And I started to use a terrible analogy where I said, look, if I think about, I said to people, if I think about where I worked before, if I think about SEGA or where you worked before, whether it was Activision or EA or wherever, let's think about it in terms of a swimming pool. And that swimming pool is a swimming pool that you're familiar with. You've just paid your £2.50 or however much it is to go swimming. It's got lanes, it's got sides. You can choose to swim up and down, but there are certain things You know that the water's clear. You know there are lanes if you want it. You know where the sides are and you know where the deep end is. So at any point in time, if you feel you don't want to swim, you know how quickly it is to get to safety. You know where to touch. You know where, If we think about Curve, think about it as like open water swimming. Think about yourself in a pool where you don't know how deep it is. You don't know where the side is. It's dirty, it's muddy, and you don't know if there's an old bike or a pram in the bottom. I said, but it's still full of water and you're still that swimmer. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to be open water swimming. I want you to be that swimmer. And again, probably a terrible analogy, but it's almost like, when I'm trying to recruit a team, it's a team that can actually deal with the fact that sometimes the safety net isn't going to be there. And how are we going to behave? How are we going to behave? And again, especially at Curve, how are we going to behave when something goes wrong and not when something goes right? How are we going to behave when we don't know the answer and we've got to find it? And when we look around ourselves, the person who's got the answer isn't here. And I think I try and sort of concentrate on that sort of attitude. So of course, getting the skills, getting the motivation sort of ticked off that list, but that fit, a lot of it was to do with how are we going to behave when the chips are down? What are we going to do? How are we going to communicate? Can we talk to each other? Can we be honest? Can we be direct? So I think a lot of the recruiting in the areas where I concentrate would be in that area.
Okay, so you've just described culture. Really, you're talking about a series of behaviors and sometimes processes, I think, and like, how are we going to behave when this happens? Or what's the, some people say, what's the North Star when everything goes wrong? Like, what should we be doing? So, I also think that CEOs have have such an outsized impact on culture and can really craft that. But obviously you came into Curve, an already established business. So how did you create the culture that you wanted there? You're saying like, okay, so you gave this analogy about you want everyone to be confident open water swimmers in something that's very ambiguous and dangerous with not a lot of safety guidelines. How did you do that? How do you instill the culture that you wanted at Curve, or in, to be honest, any of your leadership positions? Because even though Tencent and SEGA are massive businesses, you still have subcultures, and you can still create the environments within a team, within an office, within an organization. So yeah,
and I think subcultures sort of, you just mentioned that subcultures can develop anywhere, can't they, at the biggest and the smallest companies, and that's sort of like an interesting secondary discussion, I guess. But firstly, I think we'll come to Curve in a minute, but the games industry, we know it's about making games and selling games. And if you're working for a games company that isn't making games, you're not going to be selling games. So the assumption is that you have an ongoing conveyor belt of games that are being made and an ongoing conveyor belt of games that are coming out. So even whether I'm at SEGA, Tencent or Curve, I'm being dropped into a company that is currently making games and selling games. It's not stopped, and it's not starting from scratch. And I came into Curve at a particular point in time where there was a history, there was performance, there was a portfolio, and there was a roadmap, and there were games in development. There were investors, and there were investors with certain ambitions and certain requirements that were slightly different to the 12 months prior to me being at Curve. So, I was in for a particular reason, and that was, to sort of scale the company up. And, you start off and you do look at the team, you do look at the talent, you do look at the pipeline, you do look at the portfolio, and you look at how people are working together. And I always think that, my starting point for a video games publisher is down to sort of three defined areas, if you like. The first one I'd say, like the platform. And what I call the platform is actually the structure and the team. It's like, who are we? How are we structured? How do we do our job? What are our relationships like with the developers? How do we think about those relationships? What are our relationships like with the platform partners? What are our relationships like with the marketing channels? How do we work? So what does our organization look like from a people basis? So I refer to that as the platform. The next one is the portfolio. Of course, what games are we representing? What are the games that are already out or about to come out? So that is basically our grounding. That's our stability. That's our regular cash generation. That's what, if you like, on any given day pays for our platform. And then we look forward, and the outlook. What is our outlook? And our outlook is generally our future pipeline. And that's where the portfolio gives us stability for that team to be built. The portfolio gives us stability for that outlook and that pipeline to be built. And then that platform needs to deliver excellence to execute the release of that game and provide the framework for all of our future pipeline to be as successful as they can possibly be. So we know that's never a guarantee. And recently, in more cases than not, the strike rate has changed. But those are the three elements I look at. So my starting point, I think, is the platform. How are people working? Who have we got? How do they communicate? What's the culture like? How do they work with partners? And I think that's the first area that I look at is just where are we now? How are we talking to each other? How do we support each other? How do we think about our games? How do we think about our partners? Yeah. And then just within those different elements, really, is like, if we're going to build a business, how do we use that platform to keep driving our portfolio? How do we use that platform to realize the ambitions of our future pipeline?
Great.
Did that answer your question? I'm not sure if it did.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and you're also added in covering obviously how you organize the company from an operational perspective as well. I was also thinking about when you were, as you were giving me that answer about what you were saying earlier, like when you started out, you were selling packaged goods in stores, and retail had been very similar. Even though you're selling video games, retail had been very similar in the UK for decades, and now it's a case of international teams and everything else. So you joined Curve in 2020. We all know about what happened in 2020. I went fully remote, funny enough, due to COVID. Yeah. And you've also worked in large international teams. So do you have any takes on culture, people management, retaining high performers whilst now in this very different world of remote work, international teams? So you just touched on a lot of things there about how you communicate, collaborate, all of that. Like, how do you have any strategies or any really specific actionable tips for now being in a very digital workplace?
Yeah, sort of being this sort of like remote hybrid area that we're in. I'll go slightly off track. I'll tell you a slight little story. We all, when we think back to the pandemic and we think back to where we had to work at home, we didn't have any option. Go out for a little walk every morning. I think most people did that. You were allowed an hour outside.
Yep, definitely.
And we used to do that. And I remember sort of where I lived at the time. I'd go for a walk, and I hadn't lived there for very long in the area that I'd lived. Of course, because everything closed down except necessary shops, there were certain things that you couldn't get. You couldn't go to a high street chain coffee shop like a Costa or a Starbucks or a Cafe Nero just to do some advertising, because they all closed because they're part of big chains. But what I discovered when I was going on my walks was I discovered that where I lived had something that I never knew before, which was independent coffee shops. And the independent coffee shops, stayed open, and they were serving coffee at the door. And what would happen on my walk is there would be queues at the doors of the independent coffee shops, and there would be conversations that went on in the queues, and there would be conversations that went on with the barista, and there would be a level of happiness when I went back home with my coffee. And it was a few reasons why I was happy. Is one, I'd been for a walk. Two, I'd been talking to people. Three, I'd got my coffee and had a good exchange. So I went back feeling really, really positive for my day's work. And then I guess the positive side was, for my day's work, I was able to focus and I was able to concentrate. So I had a good balance. And I suppose in that snapshot, if I think about the things that were important back then, it was the ability to interact. So when we talk about where we are right now, and I don't think you've asked me specifically a question about remote working, more about communication. But if I think about what I think the importance about how I think sort of like hybrid working is the ability to have like focus time, and is the ability to also have collaborative time and face-to-face time. And I think both are really important, and I don't think it can be one or the other. Now, how does that influence communication? I think over communicate is what I'm sure people always say, but do we ever get communication right? I'm sure we don't. Do we group communication, one-to-one communication? I think I rely on both. I rely on the understanding of what empathy, from really being able to connect with someone. And I think, the online communications don't support that, as well as face-to-face communications. So I think, one-to-one conversations, group conversations, I think just community, we just need to keep using every channel we can. And, I have great calls. One of the studios I'm working with is in Sweden. And I have great calls with them. But since I've been going to visit them once a month, our entire relationship has improved, and my work output is even better. And a lot of that is for the incidental communication that we've now created space for, that happens when none of us are sitting anywhere near each other in the office, but we meet in the kitchen. So I think that's important. There's the regular check-ins, there's the discipline catch-ups, call it a stand-up meeting, call it a weekly meeting, which is more sort of disciplined and more sort of on sort of rota, if you like, of going through things. But then you have to build time for the more sort of conversational, like sort of feeling.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think about my own work setup at the moment. I'm the only UK employee in my company, and actually we're scattered across Europe and Asia. But still, by the time I get to the end of the year, between January and December, I would have met with my team in person like 5 times. And that is massively energizing, and you build trust. And so it feels like what you're saying is, take advantage of remote work and allow flexibility and everything else, but also keep that emphasis on meeting together, and because that is so powerful, so energizing and positive, like you're saying, but also it changes relationships for the better when you actually are allowed to meet each other in person. And we've met each other in person twice now, so thanks to games conferences. So it's amazing. But
I'll be completely honest with you. When I was at Curve, it was like, I guess, like the independent coffee shop. I couldn't wait to get in the office. I just couldn't wait. And, it was a long journey for me that took time out of my diary, and it cost me money. And, all these things that we'd grown accustomed to sort of getting as our own during the pandemic. But I remember the first couple of train journeys I took to go to work, and it felt really odd, because it felt as though I maybe shouldn't be doing it, because if I wasn't on that train, I would be on a call with someone. I would be getting ready for my 9 o'clock call rather than getting on my 8 o'clock train. And then the first few times I went into the office, and I was making a coffee, it was completely different to when I was at home and I was getting ready for my calls at home. And, whether it was me, and I'm sure there were lots of people like me that had back-to-back calls at home. And then, I was working at home with my wife and my family, but when I came down for the call, it was probably to get a cup of coffee, not to have a chat. And if someone said to me, hi, John, what's going on? It was like, no, I haven't got time. I've got to get back for the call. And I just ran out, I need a coffee, get back to the call. And it was that, and when I went back to the office, I just remember thinking, I'm now talking to somebody in a relaxed manner at the office in a completely different way than I was talking to my family when I was working from home. I was much more disciplined when I was at home. I was not nice to talk to, because I was like focused on the video conferences that I needed to attend. But then when I'm in the office, it's just started to feel, this is a really nice place to be. And let's talk about how we're doing this. Let's talk about, what do you feel about that game? How do you feel about that? I mean, it was a problem. There's only 3 of us, right? Because not anybody was going into the office. But that sort of grew to an extent. But I couldn't wait. And it was, from a personal level, it helped me, I would say, with things like anxiety and stress, and that could build up when you've got spaces that in between work tasks that are just open for yourself to interpret what everybody else is thinking, because you can't see them or talk to them. That I felt was not positive for me, and I'm sure I wouldn't have been the only one. So I really enjoyed working in the office, but also I'd got to a situation where sometimes my working day could almost be like a doctor's surgery, with people coming in all the times. I've got this. So sometimes I was leaving home thinking, have I achieved anything tangible? And that's where these focused days of working from home really, really come in as being valuable. So having that balance, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah, great. And there was, by the way, we're not too far off the end of this podcast episode. There was another topic that I wanted to throw your way on the theme of lessons there. But what advice would you give to people to be cautious of, like, when scaling teams, especially if you're looking to scale teams quite quickly? Is there any cautionary tales or any thoughts that you have on that you really like as teams grow and as companies grow, what are the changes that you should really be aware of and be thinking about?
I think it's speed. I think, that's the first thing, is like doing things too quickly. That's the main thing. And I think what happened with, when I joined Curve, I had so much energy, so much enthusiasm, so much excitement. I was aligned to the vision of scaling the company up, and I was looking at timelines, and we needed to execute some games that were already in the pipeline. We needed to build a future pipeline, and I think we'd set timelines that were not achievable, and I think, when I go back and rather than challenge timelines, and bear in mind 9 times out of 10, I reflect back and think, who put those timelines in, and I don't have to look too far to see who put those timelines in. So when you're sort of self-inflicting this pressure, and you've set yourself some goals and the time that you need to achieve those goals by, you set out to do the task. And when you've got a lot of energy, there's nothing stopping you. So when I think about the recruitment that I went through, and I guess there were 2 areas that we recruited. One of them was recruiting people, and the other one was recruiting studios to make games quickly. And we were hiring people quickly. And there was a common thread. I was talking to a lot of people. Our HR director at the time thought I was probably one of the best recruiters that she'd ever come across. Sorry to say that to you, Joe. Purely because I'd started talking to people in my network, saying, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to build. Are you interested? And we assembled a group of people that I was really proud of and really pleased to. But what had happened was we had done it so quickly, and we'd put ourselves under so much pressure, or I had put us all under so much pressure by building a team so quickly and signing games so quickly, that when things don't go right, we hadn't created ourselves enough space to integrate with each other, to understand how to be good at the basics. I think that's the important thing. When you recruit, make sure you integrate, make sure you're on board, make sure you get to know each other, get the basics right. That's the important thing. Get the basics right and build the space for reflection. And I think those are the 3 things. If you scale too quickly, you don't do. You build a short-term business, and a short-term business is all about the financials, and that's what you become. You sort of have to. You almost like have to drop the well-being, the culture, the thought process towards all the things that you hold dear, which is, everybody says without the people, we're nothing. But if you scale too quickly and you set yourself unreasonable goals, and you rely on the people just to give their best output and to deal with everything else on a personal level, I think that's what scaling up does. So it doesn't give the chance to integrate with each other and on board. It doesn't give the chance to set up the basic framework of how you're going to work, and it doesn't give the chance to reflect on your learnings. And then I guess the other thing is to build on those learnings and build consistent, really build your machine and your consistency and your pattern. And scaling up too quickly just sort of builds just too much. We go back to that platform and that portfolio and that outlook. It just builds too much of a fragile framework to be able to execute that plan as well as you should be. And it just doesn't help the people, because it comes too short-termist, and short-termist is all about the numbers. And, revenues, profit are obviously important to keep the games industry going, but scaling up too quickly makes it all about that and not about building the framework to achieve that.
Yeah, thanks so much for being really open and transparent about that. And this is exactly the type of thing that I speak with founders in our investment portfolio all the time. Naturally, I speak to them after they've just got investment, right? And it can be like, right, it's go time. Let's hire. It's like, hey, let's just assess the foundations here. Have you got your really good processes for onboarding in place? Have you got really clear culture and a mission and values around that? Is everyone clear on why we are hiring and why we're growing? Even just do you have a solid interview process for a start? All of these things which feel like slowing down the growth, but really they're just to ensure that you have longer term success.
Yeah, and that's when you talk about subcultures, talk about retention, talk about employee satisfaction and progress and all that sort of stuff. And I'm well aware of the, I can sort of sit on this call and say, I've got the answers, I know what to do. And I think, I feel as though I do know what to do, but the question is can I demonstrate anywhere in my career where I absolutely haven't done that? And the answer is yes, I can demonstrate that. Have I learnt from it? The answer is yes. This isn't any sort of cleansing call, by the way. This is, very much, these things do happen. And scaling up too quickly can be damaging. And it's at what point do you know it? Because when you've got, as you say, when you've got something new, if I'm a founder and I've just raised funds to actually, sort of deliver my vision, am I, wearing my heart on my sleeve and full of excitement and sort of join me in this, this amazing opportunity? And a lot of people jump in with that enthusiasm. A lot of people are aligned to the energy that you're creating, and a lot of people bring that energy with them. And it's only, when something doesn't go to plan that, depending on how you behave to that, that's when subcultures can form, because it could be this didn't quite work and we're not sharing or discussing why it didn't work. We're actually still going forward. We're saying, don't worry, that's one of 10 things that didn't work. Let's make the other 9 work, and that one doesn't matter. So let's keep going. And then the second thing doesn't work. Oh, don't worry, we've still got 8. Let's keep going. And at some point, people will start to say, well, we can't talk to the leader of the organisation about this, because when's he going to stop? Is it oh no, we've still got 3 more to go, 2 more to go. Don't worry, keep going. When are we going to reflect? And that's when, subcultures will form around that. They'll form around the gaps. They'll form around the dissatisfaction, and people will look for sort of groups and alliances that actually, are less short-term than the quick scale-up approach.
Yeah. Thank you for that, John. And yeah, that's really insightful. So appreciate it. We are at the end though, and I feel we could easily. Yeah, we are at the end. It's flown by. I feel I say this quite often, but I know I don't feel like we could chat forever. I know that we could chat so much about these topics. But we are at optimal podcast length, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
Yeah. The last question to ask you that I've asked everyone is, what is your favorite interview question? I mean, do you even have one? I suppose, but if so, what is it?
I don't really, but whenever I get to the end of an interview, I suppose it's whether it's me or whether it's somebody else. I always think, so for an interview, basically, I just want it to be an environment where people can demonstrate their best, and therefore they can feel comfortable. What started out sort of, I would say 35 years ago in my career as a very sort of cheeky question full of ego and full of bravado has turned into a question that I think is really sort of reasonable and heartfelt from me. So if I sort of say the 21-year-old John Clark would say at the end of an interview to a job he was going for, he would sort of put his shoulders back and look in the eyes and say, have you got any questions or any doubts over why I'm not the right person for this job? Right? That was the close for the sales job. And I think right now that's sort of morphed into a question either way, which is, have you got any sort of doubts or questions on what it is we've been talking about? Have you said everything that you want? Have you asked me everything that you want to ask? Is there anything that's been on your mind that you want to get out of the way right now, because now's a really good time to do it? So that's sort of morphed into that. It's like that one last thing that, I always think, can you create that water cooler moment? Can you, I always think when people are leaving and saying goodbye, and I don't know if it's true in your life or it certainly isn't, I can show you where it happens all the time. People are saying goodbye and they're leaving for the door and they stop and they say, oh, before I go, have you bang, bang, bang? And I just sort of try and create that before I go environment. Before you go, before I go, what is there? There is something. And that's it. Just try and create that environment. Just go in and sort of check at the end.
Reminds me of that Columbo, and he's like, just one more thing, before he heads out the door. Yeah. It happened. Yeah, but I really like that. In fact, first of all, your point about making a welcoming environment. I often say, like, you can make an interview challenging. In fact, you should. It should be a challenging thing, but it's not a dichotomy, right? You can make it welcoming as well as thought-provoking and challenging. And also that point of, as a candidate, when you prepare for an interview, especially a job that you really, really want, you've probably done a lot of preparation. And sometimes it can be quite frustrating. You get all the way to the end of the interview and you're like, I'm prepared to really talk about this that I think is I'm really passionate about, or something like that. And so, yeah, just that call to be like, is there anything that I'm missing? Sometimes I will change that question to be something like, is there anything that you prepared for this interview that I haven't asked you about today that you really want to talk about? And it's exactly the same reasons you were saying about, John.
Yeah, same thing. And I know we're at the end, but you can get so much from those questions of like, what's your experience? What's your motivation? You can get a lot of that. It's factual. You can get a lot of that before the interview. You can get a lot of that from the CV. But, for me, the interview is, does this feel right? Do we feel right for each other? Does this, that fit thing? So I tend to try and use interviews to create the environment that can we visualize working with each other? Can we visualize working each other here? Do we think it's going to work? Do we connect? That sort of stuff. So it's sort of creating that environment rather than creating I want to ask you about this and you said this, but show me the evidence and all that sort of stuff. Of course I want to talk through that. I want to be able to verify things, but really for me, interviews are a lot about the fit.
Yeah, and I've even noticed it with podcast episodes, like, sometimes where I've clicked the stop button on recording, and then someone's like, I really wish we had actually covered this, and then they ramble something really insightful. So yeah, I guess, John, is there anything that we didn't cover today that you would like to talk about?
Loads, but we're at optimal time for a podcast episode.
Yeah, sorry, I just told you. I was like, right, we're about to finish. Anything else? Yeah, any closing statements? My bad.
Yeah. No, look, this has been
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, you're about to say something there, John.
This has just been, really enjoyable. It's really been good to have this chat, Joe. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for coming on the episode today, and wishing you all the best, and I hope you get to catch up another games conference soon.